Most people eating bread every morning have no idea what's actually in it. In February 2026, the Florida Department of Health tested 8 bread products from 5 major national brands, pulled straight off grocery store shelves, and sent them to an independent lab for analysis. 6 out of 8 came back positive for glyphosate, the active chemical in Roundup weed killer. Not out in a farm field somewhere. In the finished, sliced loaf sitting in your kitchen right now. This isn't a fringe claim from an anonymous corner of the internet either. It's a state health department working with a certified lab, publishing its methodology and its numbers for anyone to check. This wasn't a one-off headline either. Back in 2022, the Detox Project ran one of the largest independent glyphosate studies ever conducted on the American food supply. They pulled bread, oats, and legumes from major retailers, Walmart, Target, Whole Foods, Hy-Vee, and sent every sample to an EPA-certified laboratory for mass spectrometry testing, the same method regulators themselves use. What they found lines up with something that should genuinely bother you. The worst results didn't always come from the cheapest bread on the shelf. Some of the highest numbers came from organic labels, from whole grain loaves, from the exact products marketed to people who specifically pay more because they believe they're making the safer choice for their families. One brand on this list tested above 1,000 parts per billion of glyphosate, one of the highest levels ever recorded in a packaged consumer bread sold in the United States. You will almost certainly recognize the parent company behind it, even if the name on the bag doesn't ring a bell. Here's the mechanism behind almost everything you're about to hear. Glyphosate isn't only used the way most people assume, sprayed on weeds growing between crop rows. On many conventional wheat farms, it's also applied directly to the standing crop itself in the final days before harvest. As a pre-harvest desiccant, the chemical dries the plant out faster, which lets farmers get into the field and collect the grain a little sooner, at slightly lower cost. That timing is exactly what makes it show up in your bread. Spraying weeks before harvest out in the field gives the plant time to break the chemical down. Spraying days before harvest directly onto the grain that's about to be milled into flour doesn't leave nearly as much time. The residue rides along, straight from the field into the mill, into the dough, and onto your plate. We're counting down 10 brands with confirmed independent lab detections, from concerning to genuinely shocking, and finishing with 4 that came back completely clean. Let's get into it. Number 10. Wonder Bread Classic White. Wonder Bread has never tried to be organic or artisanal. It sells itself as the American staple, the soft white loaf that's been sitting on kitchen counters for over 100 years, the one that built its entire identity on nostalgia rather than nutrition. In February 2026, the Florida Department of Health tested Wonder Bread Classic White and recorded 173.19 parts per billion of glyphosate. Wonder Bread is owned by Flowers Foods, a publicly traded baking company that also owns Nature's Own, a brand you're about to meet in a moment. For context, the EPA's legal tolerance for glyphosate on grains sits at 30 parts per million, which works out to 30,000 parts per billion. So yes, on paper, 173 parts per billion is comfortably inside that federal limit, but that tolerance number was calculated for one chemical from one food source in isolation. It says nothing about a person who's also picking up glyphosate residue from their morning cereal, their afternoon crackers, and their pasta at dinner. Exposure accumulates across a day, a week, a lifetime. The regulatory tolerance was never built to track that accumulation. It was built to check a single box. While you're thinking about that, take a look at what else is actually printed on a bag of Wonder Classic White. The published ingredient label lists dough conditioners that can include sodium stearoyl lactylate, calcium peroxide, and dadium, along with calcium sulfate and calcium propionate specifically added to slow down spoilage. None of that is hidden. It's all disclosed right there on the back of the bag in compliance with federal labeling law. But it's also a genuinely long list of industrial additives for a product whose entire pitch is simplicity. Flour, water, yeast, salt. The actual ingredient panel tells a very different story than the nostalgic red, yellow, and blue packaging does. Number 9. Nature's Own Butter Bread. Same testing round, same Florida State lab, a different loaf from that same Flowers Foods portfolio. Nature's Own Butter Bread came back at 190.23 parts per billion, higher than Wonder Bread. From the same parent company, tested on the very same day using the very same method. Nature's Own has spent years marketing itself as the wholesome, natural alternative to something like Wonder Bread. The name itself does a lot of the reassuring work before a shopper even reads the ingredient list. The lab result doesn't match the branding. If anything, the natural option in this company's own lineup tested worse than the one that never made any such claim. Number 8. Sara Lee Honey Wheat. This is the single highest reading in Florida's entire February 2026 testing round, 191, 4 parts per billion. Higher than Wonder Bread. Higher than Nature's Own Butter Bread, in that same lab, using that same method, on that same day. Sara Lee has been a fixture in American kitchens for generations. The name people associate with holidays, birthdays, and family gatherings, not laboratory contamination data. Sara Lee's bread division has been owned since 2011 by Bimbo Bakeries USA, the American subsidiary of Grupo Bimbo, one of the largest baking companies on the planet. Grupo Bimbo paid $709 million to acquire Sara Lee's North American fresh bakery business, along with 41 U.S. plants and thousands of delivery routes. Read the ingredient label on honey wheat, and you'll notice corn syrup doing the actual sweetening, while the word honey does the marketing on the front of the bag. That gap between the name and the ingredients is completely legal. It's also exactly the kind of gap this entire investigation keeps running into, loaf after loaf. Number 7. Sara Lee 100% whole wheat bread. A different Sara Lee product, tested in a different independent round. This one sampled from Target shelves and analyzed as part of the Detox Project's broader 2022 study. And it still came back positive at 284 parts per billion. 2 separate Sara Lee breads. 2 independent testing rounds, years apart, run by 2 completely different organizations. 2 positive results. Whatever is happening somewhere in that supply chain isn't a single bad batch or a one-time fluke. It's a pattern showing up consistently, across different products, across different years, under different testing bodies. Number 6. Great value 100% whole wheat. This is Walmart's house bread, the one that fills carts across the country because it's cheap, familiar, and always in stock, in every store, in every town. The Detox Project's independent lab testing found 340 parts per billion of glyphosate in great value whole wheat. In that same study, a different great value product, great value chickpeas, tested as high as 889 parts per billion in one sample, which suggests this isn't isolated to a single loaf on a single shelf, but points to something happening further back in how the private label supply chain sources its grain and legumes more broadly. Walmart is the largest retailer on the planet, operating thousands of stores and generating revenue that rivals the GDP of entire countries. Sourcing cleaner grain for a private label loaf isn't a resource constraint at that scale. It's a decision about where the company chooses to protect its margin and where it chooses to spend it. The savings a shopper gets at checkout came bundled with something extra that never made it onto the label. Number 5. Market Pantry 100% whole wheat sandwich bread. Target's older budget tier private label bread tested at 348 parts per billion in that same Detox Project study, slightly higher than Walmart's version from the retailer that many shoppers consider the more curated, more design-conscious of the 2 big box chains. Target has spent the last several years building out its newer Good and Gather line specifically to signal cleaner ingredient standards free of artificial flavors, synthetic colors, and high fructose corn syrup. And that line now brings in roughly $2 billion a year in sales on its own. Market Pantry, meanwhile, kept running quietly in the background as an older, cheaper tier, getting less marketing attention and apparently less scrutiny, even while it remains stocked on shelves right next to its cleaner marketed sibling brand. A shopper who assumed the budget option in the premium store brand were roughly equivalent in quality actually picked the one that tested higher for glyphosate. Number 4. Pepperidge Farm Jewish Rye and Pumpernickel Deli Swirl. Now we start climbing into different territory entirely. Pepperidge Farm has been baking since 1937 and carries a premium old-fashioned image. The red bag, the script lettering, the brand people specifically reach for when they want to feel like they're buying something better than the bread next to it. It's owned by the Campbell's Company, a multi-billion-dollar packaged food corporation that has held the brand since the early 1960s. Independent lab testing found 531 parts per billion of glyphosate in this particular rye and pumpernickel loaf. roughly 3 times what Wonder Bread recorded in Florida's own state testing. The heritage packaging and the laboratory result are not telling the same story about what's actually inside the bag. Number 3. Pepperidge Farm 100% whole grain whole wheat bread. Same company, same premium brand. An even higher number this time, 587 parts per billion. Here's the mechanism worth actually understanding, because it explains a pattern you're going to see repeat itself on this list. Glyphosate is sometimes applied as a pre-harvest desiccant, sprayed directly onto standing wheat just days before harvest, specifically to dry the crop out faster and speed up collection. That late-season application concentrates residue in the outer hull of the wheat kernel. Whole grain bread retains that hull as part of its nutritional pitch. White bread, milled from flour that's had the hull stripped away, often doesn't carry nearly as much of it, which means the healthier, whole grain loaf, the one marketed specifically for its fiber and nutrients, can end up carrying more contamination than the plain white bread sitting right next to it on the very same shelf, from the very same company. Worth noting, in fairness, Florida's testing found 0 detectable glyphosate in a different Pepperidge Farm product entirely. Farmhouse Hardy White, same brand name on the bag. Wildly different result, depending entirely on which specific loaf and which specific supply chain you happen to grab. Number 2. 365 whole wheat sandwich bread. Whole Foods Market's own house organic brand. This is where the story turns genuinely uncomfortable. Amazon acquired Whole Foods in 2017 for $13.7 billion, buying not just a grocery chain, but a decades-old reputation built specifically on ingredient purity. The store that banned artificial colors, synthetic preservatives, and dozens of other additives long before most competitors even considered it, publishing a list of more than 70 unacceptable ingredients that it simply refuses to stock. The Detox Project's independent testing found 1040 parts per billion of glyphosate in the 365 whole wheat sandwich loaf, purchased directly off a Whole Foods shelf and sent to the same EPA-certified lab used for every other product in the study. That number isn't close to the store's own stated standards. It isn't close to what a shopper paying a noticeable premium at Whole Foods would reasonably expect to find on the one shelf in the store built around trust. And here's the detail that makes it worse. Across that same 2022 study, roughly 18 of 26 products carrying a non-GMO verified label also tested positive for glyphosate, sometimes at levels among the highest recorded in the entire report. The researchers themselves called that finding an irony worth sitting with. People specifically buying non-GMO to avoid Monsanto's genetically engineered seeds while unknowingly picking up high levels of Monsanto's best-known chemical anyway, through a completely different pathway they never thought to check. A non-GMO verified seal only confirms the absence of genetically modified ingredients. It says nothing about pesticide residue, and it was never designed to. Number 1. Village Hearth 100% whole wheat bread, Hy-Vee's private label bread. This is the single highest number in the entire dataset, 1,150 parts per billion, even higher than the Whole Foods loaf you just heard about, higher than every brand on this list. It's a regional Midwest grocery chain's own house bread, which means most of the country outside Hy-Vee's footprint has probably never heard the name, and that's exactly what makes this result so telling. This isn't one bad actor cutting corners. It's a private label wheat bread from a completely different, unrelated regional retailer landing at the absolute top of independent testing alongside a national retail giant, a beloved heritage brand, and an organic grocery chain, when the highest number in the whole study comes from 4 completely unconnected companies. That tells you the underlying issue isn't sitting inside any single company's factory. It's sitting somewhere further upstream in how conventional wheat is grown and dried across this country before any of these companies ever touch it. If you're still with us, here's some context worth having before we get to the good news. Glyphosate was classified as probably carcinogenic to humans by the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer back in 2015, a classification Bayer has consistently and publicly disputed ever since. Since then, Bayer, which acquired Monsanto in 2018 along with all of its Roundup liability, has already paid out more than $10 billion settling claims from people who developed non-Hodgkin lymphoma after Roundup exposure, across tens of thousands of individual lawsuits filed nationwide. In February 2026, Bayer proposed an additional $7.25 billion settlement to resolve both current and future claims, structured to pay out over 21 years, with individual payouts ranging anywhere from roughly $6,000 up to $165,000, depending on the severity of the case. To fund it, Bayer increased its total litigation provisions from €7.8 billion to €11.8 billion and took out an $8 billion bank loan to manage the immediate cash impact. Some of the law firms representing plaintiffs have pushed back on the proposal, arguing the compensation structure undervalues what people affected are actually owed, and a Missouri court has been working through objections before granting the deal final approval. That same month, President Trump signed an executive order invoking the Defense Production Act aimed at shielding glyphosate manufacturers from further liability, framing the chemical as critical to the country's agricultural production and food supply chain. Then in June 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Bayer's favor in a case called Monsanto versus Durnal, finding that federal pesticide labeling law can preempt certain state-level failure to warn lawsuits, a ruling that could make future cases against the company significantly harder to bring going forward. Between the settlement, the executive order, and the Supreme Court ruling, all landing within the same several months, 2026 has effectively become the year this entire legal fight started closing, one way or another. To be fair to the other side of this, it isn't a settled argument, and pretending otherwise wouldn't be honest. The American Bakers Association responded directly to Florida's bread testing by pointing out that every single result fell well within the federal tolerance limit, that no recalls were issued, and that no law was broken by any of the brands involved. Some toxicologists have also publicly criticized Florida's public reporting for releasing raw parts per billion numbers without the underlying lab methodology or regulatory context needed to properly interpret them, arguing that a number alone, without a scale to measure it against, can create more fear than understanding. Detection is not automatically the same thing as danger, and that distinction genuinely matters. It's a fair point, and industry groups aren't wrong to raise it. What nobody on either side of this argument disputes, though, is the underlying fact itself. The chemical is there, showing up in bread more often than not, at levels that simply weren't present in the American food supply at anywhere near this scale a few decades ago. Now that you know what to actively avoid, here are 4 brands that held up under independent testing and are genuinely worth the extra money. Best option number 4. Pepperidge Farmhouse Hardy White. This is the same company you just heard about twice on the avoid list, which is precisely the point worth remembering. Florida's February 2026 testing found no detectable glyphosate whatsoever in this specific product. Ownership alone doesn't determine what ends up in any one particular loaf. If you're loyal to this brand for whatever reason, this is the exact product to reach for on your next grocery run. And the rye and whole grain wheat lines from the same shelf are the ones worth leaving behind. Best option number 3. Sara Lee Artesano White. The same pattern shows up again here. The Sara Lee name appears twice on the avoid list already, for its whole wheat and honey wheat lines specifically, and this white artisanal loaf tested at 0 detectable glyphosate in that very same February 2026 Florida testing round. One parent company, one brand name printed on every bag, 3 different products, 3 completely different outcomes. The name on the front of the bag genuinely won't tell you which one you're holding. Only the specific product will. Best option number 2. Silver Hills Sprouted Bakery. This is a different tier of bread entirely, and it deserves to be treated that way. Silver Hills holds glyphosate residue-free certification from the Detox project, which means its products are independently tested multiple times a year and verified below the laboratory's detection threshold, rather than checked once and simply left alone indefinitely. Silver Hills is a family-owned Canadian bakery, and its sprouted grain loaves are widely available across the United States at natural grocery chains and increasingly at mainstream ones too, alongside a matching product lineup available in Canada through major national chains. When the WHO's Cancer Research Agency classified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen back in 2015, the company has publicly said that finding directly reshaped how it sources grain going forward. That's a company responding to the evidence in front of it, rather than lobbying quietly against it behind closed doors. The product line is plant-based and free of nuts, which also makes it one of the more accessible clean options for households managing allergies alongside everything else on this list. Best option number 1. Food for Life. The makers of Ezekiel bread, also currently carrying Detox Project Glyphosate residue-free certification as of 2026, Food for Life sprouts its grains before baking, rather than starting from pre-milled flour the way nearly every other brand on this list does. Its bread is made from a combination of sprouted wheat, barley, millet, lentils, soybeans, and spelt. That's a fundamentally different process from start to finish, and it shows up clearly the moment you actually read the ingredient panel. No dough conditioners, no added sugar. Nothing on the list that needs a chemistry background to pronounce or understand. You'll typically find it sitting in the freezer section rather than the regular bread aisle, and there's a simple reason for that. Without the industrial preservatives that keep most commercial bread soft for weeks at room temperature, this bread simply doesn't last that long unrefrigerated. That's not a flaw hiding in the product. That's what bread looks like when it hasn't been engineered specifically for a long shelf life. It also tends to have a noticeably lower glycemic impact than standard white or wheat sandwich bread, which is a separate benefit from the glyphosate story, but worth knowing if blood sugar is something you're already tracking. Before you close this out, here's the one distinction worth actually remembering, because it's the single most useful thing in this entire investigation. A USDA organic label tells you that the grower didn't intentionally apply glyphosate during the growing process. It does not tell you that the finished packaged loaf tested clean in a lab. Drift contamination from a neighboring conventional field, or contamination introduced somewhere further up a shared supply chain, isn't something the organic certification process checks for at all. The two certifications that actually require laboratory testing of the finished product itself, rather than just the farming method used to grow it, are the Detox Project's Glyphosate Residue-Free Seal and the biochecked non-glyphosate certified seal. Those are the two labels worth actually looking for on a bag if you want documented proof rather than a well-intentioned promise. And here's the practical takeaway to carry with you into your next grocery run. Within any single brand, results can swing dramatically between individual products. Sara Lee's Honey Wheat and Sara Lee's Artisanal White came from the exact same company and landed on opposite ends of this entire list. Pepperidge Farm's Rye and its Farmhouse White did the same thing. So it's genuinely worth checking the specific loaf in your hand, not just trusting the name printed across the front of the bag. If you want to go a layer deeper than the label, both the Detox Project and BioChecked maintain public, searchable databases of every product they've certified, and they update as new brands apply and new results come in. Before buying anything that claims to be glyphosate-free, it takes about 10 seconds to search the brand and the specific product on either site and see the actual documentation for yourself, instead of taking a marketing claim at face value. That single habit, more than memorizing any list of brand names, is what actually protects you as store shelves change and companies reformulate products over time. It's also worth remembering that wheat isn't the only crop where this shows up. The same pre-harvest desiccation practice is used on oats, barley, chickpeas, lentils, and several other staple crops, which means cereal, crackers, hummus, and pasta can carry the same kind of residue for the exact same reason. Bread just happens to be the food most people eat every single day without thinking twice about it, which is exactly why it's the right place to start paying attention. You don't need to memorize every number on this list, and you don't need to swear off bread entirely. You just need to start flipping the bag over before it goes in your cart and asking one simple question: is this specific product tested, or is it just labeled? If this changed the way you look at your own bread aisle, passing it along to someone who regularly buys one of these brands is probably the single most useful thing you can do with what you just learned.